Tonight on Under the Microscope, we venture into the political and military drama known as the Korean War. The war in which capitalism and communism first fought against each other on the battlefield, paving the way for future proxy wars such as Vietnam. We invite Dr. Rudolf Steiner as he attempts to explain why communism failed in conquering South Korea and why it was so crucial in the ultimate result of the Korean War. But first, we have to ask ourselves, what was the Korean War? Following World War II, tensions arose between the Russian and Chinese supporting North Korea and the American and United Nations forces who were backing South Korea. This ultimately created a permanent divide at the 38th degree of latitude, named the 38th parallel. This tension finally broke with the invasion of South Korea on the 25th of June 1950, resulting in what is known as the Korean War. Numerous battles were fought throughout this time, initiating with the first Battle of Seoul at the very beginning, up until the final battle, known as the Battle of Pork Chop Hill, on the 16th of April 1953. The primary reasons as to why the Korean War began was North Koreans' ambition to capture Seoul, South Korea's capital, and to ultimately spread communism throughout Korea. A total of 37 countries and over 6 million armed forces supported either North Korean or South Korean forces. An accumulation of over 80 battles were fought, resulting in the deaths of 2,614,814 people. Now on to tonight's special segment with Dr. Rudolf Steiner. Over to you, Larry. Thank you, Nick. Now, it's a real pleasure to be with you tonight, Dr. Rudolf Steiner.
Well, thank you very much, Larry. Pleasure's all mine. Please call me Rudolf.
Of course. Now, I would like to ask you a few questions about the Korean War. Now, first off, I'd like to ask you, what do you think the most significant battle of the Korean War was, and why is this so?
Oh, look, Larry, it'd probably be the Battle of Incheon, which was an amphibious invasion involving over 260 ships and over 76,000 troops. So what this was General Douglas MacArthur, who was the head of the American forces and as a large part the UN forces. He launched an invasion into Incheon on what was known as Red Beach, and the idea was that he was pushing aside all of the cautiousness that the previous generals had used, and in order to surprise the Koreans, he went into uncharted terrain and invaded there using the element of surprise to overwhelm the attackers. This also led to the retaking of Seoul later on, about 2 weeks later, so it had a lot of significance in the Korean War.
Okay. And what do you think about the peace talks between North and South Korea today?
So the peace talks today are a bit interesting because if you have a look back during when the Korean War was on, when the peace talks started in July of 1951, they were quite sort of one-sided, where the UN, South Korea, Americans were really trying to launch peace talks and wanted to bring the war to a halt as soon as possible. But the North Koreans were proving quite difficult to negotiate against because they really wanted South Korea. They wanted Korea to all fall under communist rule. So if you have a look at the peace talks today, as you well know, the Korean War still technically hasn't ended. There was just a ceasefire. So tensions are quite high between South Korea and North Korea right now. So that's why it's quite important that the peace talks that are going on now go on. But with a sort of a leader like Kim Jong-un, who's a bit, nutty, it's proving quite difficult to sort of reason with someone like that.
It's extraordinary. What do you think the communist North Korean side failed to maintain North Korea? Why do you think they failed to maintain such a large, massive land?
Look, Larry, that sort of comes down to a couple of reasons. The first reason would be the actual intrinsic principle of communism. So what this sort of meant was, in the war, the officers and the men were distinctly separate, and for someone trying to fight a war, for someone trying to lead troops into battle, it's not very good for morale and not very good for the overall strategy to have your enlisted men and your officers separate. And the second problem is that the Koreans and the Chinese, as a sort of proxy, were promoting soldiers to officers based off their affiliations with the Communist Party and not off merit. So this meant that you had more politicians in the officers' role than actual, good tacticians and good strategists. And this meant that the battles and stuff were largely overruled by one strategician, but all of his officers were unable to make their own decisions and follow tactics because they didn't actually have any foreknowledge of this. The third problem was just the idea that the communists actually had less troop training. Their troops were less experienced. Their troops weren't trained to as high of a standard as the UN troops were. And the equipment was a much lower standard. So if you have a look at the UN troops, which was the Americans, British, Australians, New Zealanders, a couple of other smaller nations, their training was really sort of above par, and their experience, they just come out of World War II. If you have a look, for example, even the overriding leader of the Americans, Douglas MacArthur, he had just come back from fighting the Pacific, so he was an experienced battle-hardened leader.
Sure.
Most of the officers and soldiers were experienced and battle-hardened, and the troops were well-equipped, as the Americans and the UN could afford to give, the best equipment, best guns, the best jets, the best ships to their troops to allow them to win.
So Rudolph, what do you think the primary tactics of the Korean War were?
So if we have a look at the Korean War, there are a couple of tactics used. The first was the sort of age of jets. It was the first battle in which jets versus other jets in what we call a dogfight. And it was also the first age in which jets were supporting ground troops. If you have a look at the actual tactics used on the ground, it was very similar to World War II. So it was very much, moving platoons and companies and battalions, and, they would all sort of form up in big, large manoeuvres on a, grand scale against the communists. But the troop v troop fighting, this sort of individual tactics were, again, very similar to World War II.
Of course. So, how do you think that the Korean War has affected modern-day Korea, knowing that there is now a North and South?
So if we have a look at modern-day Korea, we see quite some interesting discrepancies. So we'll start off with South Korea, and it's sort of your typical Western Asian economy. So you have a look at the economy, it's booming, it's got a GDP of around $1 trillion, which equates to about 50,000 per capita. It's got, its production is booming, lots of products are coming out of South Korea and getting bought up by, other Western countries. The people there are pretty happy, it's a democracy, stuff like that. Whereas if you have a look at North Korea, its people have been brainwashed by the Kim Jong-un regime. Its people are getting tortured, they're all starving, there's famine, half the country doesn't have electricity. But what's interesting about North Korea now is that with the advent of things like smartphones and stuff, which are becoming cheaper and cheaper, news about the outside world is actually starting to come into North Korea, which, if you have a look at the sort of politics of Korea, is actually stirring up a bit of trouble, and there might be some revolutions in the future.
Thank you, Dr. Stein, for all that. Back to Nick at the desk.
Thank you.
Taking into account that the Korean War ended with a ceasefire, what effect did this have on both North and South Korea's economy? The war ultimately ended in a ceasefire between the two countries. However, American troops remained stationed in South Korea for the event of an invasion from the north. The two nations were left in ruins, with North Korea using 71,000 of the 80,000 South Korean prisoners of war to attempt to rebuild North Korea's infrastructure. In the 1950s, North Korea had modest economic growth. However, this didn't translate into increased growth through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, ultimately resulting in a near economic crash in the 1990s. On the other hand, South Korea's economy suffered greatly in the 1950s, but started to flourish again with the opening of trade with Japan in the 1960s, having this growth continue to expand today. That brings the curtain down on yet another episode of Under the Microscope. Join us next week. Thank you, Australia. And good night.